Okay, so here's the final video for this week on Augustine. I'm not gonna go into a huge amount of detail about Augustine's view. In general, we're still kind of setting up the issues by using some of these historical figures to give us some context and to introduce ideas that we'll go into greater detail about later on. But I like to give a little bit of background as well, historical background. As I keep emphasising, it's not necessary that you know all this historical background, but it's for interest's sake, really. So, okay, who was Augustine? Um, he only flourished, unfortunately. He didn't live, so this means we're not quite sure about his dates. So we go back to the idea of flourishing. It's a bit odd that we don't know about his dates, though, because he was living within the Roman Empire, which usually kept pretty good records, but not in this case. Maybe it's worth actually. I'll go to my little map here to give the context. So Augustine was a bishop or a priest, and he was living within the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire had become largely Catholic by this time. I'm not going to give we're quite late on in the Roman Empire here, as you can see. 380. Oh, that's meant to be AD. 380 AD. Is the Roman Empire was soon to go into a kind of terminal decline. So the Romans left Britain shortly after about 410 AD, somewhere around there. But the Romans had conquered much of the known world, including the Greek world that we spoke about earlier. And yeah, this is the key thing. They'd conquered down here in Africa. And this is where Augustine was from. And by all accounts, although he's often represented as being white, there's actually pretty good evidence that he was African, the black man, and he lived down here in Algiers. And in fact, yes, this is where he held his post. He was in Annaba on the coast. He was actually, it seems to be that he was born. He wasn't a Roman citizen when he was born, but he became a Roman citizen. At any rate, there he was, down there, in the kind of the twilight of the Roman Empire. But, the main areas around Rome, and it's pretty close to Rome, were still holding on fine and still doing okay. The Visigoths and so on were coming in and sacking Rome, but he lived a pretty safe life. And it enabled him lots of time for philosophical reflection. His most famous book, The Confessions, then, was actually to do with his conversion to Christianity. So he wasn't born he didn't have a Christian upbringing, but converted later on. And The Confessions is this sort of weird. It's actually a very interesting read. I recommend it. This sort of autobiographical account of his conversion to Christianity. But within The Confessions, we also get all these philosophical reflections as well, and that's the one that we're going to be interested in, the philosophical reflections. Chapter 11 in particular is good, and it's there that he talks about time. Two things of note, really. The first one is he asked this question, and this was known to be a bit of a puzzle at the time. Why did God create the world when he did? So if you're a Christian, you believe that God created the world. But then there's a good question, given that God... So this relates to a principle that we're going to talk about in relation to Leibniz a bit later, but also one that comes in here. The principle is called the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz held it in a non-theological context. So in a non-theological context, it's the thought that everything that happens for some reason or other. That is, everything happens at the time that it does and the place that it does for a particular reason. And this principle was thought by Augustine and Christians at the time to hold with God as well. God never does anything arbitrarily. God never does anything, on a whim. He's always got a sufficient reason for doing what he does. So then the question is, if the world was created, why did God create it at exactly the time that he did? Why not 100 years earlier, 1,000 years earlier, 1,000,000 years earlier? So we're supposed to here be imagining God sat around up in heaven for the eternity of time before he created the universe, twiddling his thumbs, I suppose. Well, if he's got thumbs. But just sort of sat there, and then he suddenly decides, okay, I'm going to create the universe, and then boom, does it. And there's a question there, well, why does he do it then? Why didn't he do it earlier? Right, there's the puzzle. Why did the universe come into existence at the time it did? Why did God do it when he did? Yeah, so this is the idea here that God is eternal, but the universe came into existence at a past time by divine action. Principle of sufficient reason problem, I said about this. And Augustine rather takes Plato's way out here. He wants to say, well, so remember we've got those two distinctions that I said were important between existing forever and ever and ever, that notion of eternity, and the other Platonic concept, which is existing timelessly, or outside of time in some sense. And what Augustine wants to say is that God exists in that second sense. He's not like he was knocking around for eternity before he decided to create the world and then at a particular moment brought the world into existence. His idea is that, well, actually God exists outside of time, so when he created the world, he also created time then. So that is, the first moment of existence for the universe was also the very first moment of time. Okay? So here we've got this, I mean, whether or not we believe in God and the Christian story of creation and so on, here we do have this idea that does it really make, we can ask the following question, does it make sense to suppose that the universe came into existence at a particular time? Or do we have to think that the first moment of time is also the first moment of the universe? Does time go back infinitely, in other words, or is there a first moment of time? And it's a very puzzling question. We saw a bit earlier that one of the interpretations of Anaximander was to do with this thought that, well, surely there was a time before the first time, and if you follow that line down, you end up being pushed to this idea that time is goes back forever in that first sense of eternity. But Augustine didn't think that. He thought it did make sense to suppose that time had a beginning. We can talk about that. I'm not entirely certain, to be honest with you, that it does make sense. And well, we can talk about that. All right. The second thing then that we want to talk about with regards to Augustine is his position of presentism. And so this is the view that only the present moment exists. And I'm recording this just shortly after the seminar that we've just had, where we spoke a bit about this, and I wasn't sure. So presentism is often taken to be the common sense view of time. It's not clear to me that it is, and there are questions about the notion of existence and being real which are raised, which I'm going to think about a bit more. But yeah, it is taken to be the common sense view. It's certainly Augustine's view. And I also asked the question, well, how thick is the present? You know, I mean, if only the present moment exists, for example, is it like a second long and you get this kind of moving second that we exist in the present, or is it meant to be shorter? And what's the answer to that? Augustine had an answer. In fact, he thought that the present moment was an instantaneous point. Okay? He thought that the present moment had no temporal thickness at all. So all that exists is like this instantaneous temporal moment. That's the present, and that's everything that exists within that instantaneous present. Yes, so I want to tie this in a little bit now, just a couple of comments about what we said before about time being infinitely divisible. And remember I said that if you've got a if you keep dividing the things up, well, if you've got a point in time, there's no next point in time. And in fact, it seems hard to see how that you can ever get down to an instantaneous point at all on this kind of a view. So I before, when talked about Zeno and dividing up time infinitely, I mentioned this idea of a point in time. But really, if you just keep dividing things up, there are just cuts in time. Relates to Aristotle's idea of the cut as well. And I'm not going to say too much more about this. All I'm going to say is there are a lot of puzzles that get raised if you think that the present moment is an instantaneous point. The difficulty is if you think that the present isn't an instantaneous point, but has rather got some breadth to it, then you've also got problems which we'll come to as well. So I'm not actually going to say any more about these issues now. I just want to bring in Augustine and give his view as I've done, and just point to the fact that there are issues arising from this, things that we're going to need to consider further and things that we will consider further as we go. So this week has really all been about looking through these historical figures, trying to interpret what they say where it's not clear, trying to raise some ideas, raise some points to see that some of these problems that are dealt with in the contemporary debate have been dealt with at least in the past by maybe they didn't see what the problems were, maybe they didn't resolve those problems, and so on. But they're raised by a lot of the things that are in the history, even if they haven't been dealt with in the clarity which they've been dealt with until the contemporary literature. And by the way, still much remains unclear. So a lot of what we're going to be doing is trying to get clear about a lot of these things. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much, and I'll have a go at the seminar questions, read the first chapter, where much of what I've spoken about is also covered. Some of it isn't, and there's a bit more detail in some places. But overall, I hope that these videos complement the textbook reading well. And at the bottom of the page this week, I'll be posting some suggested extra readings for you to have a look at if you want. I'm not going to put too many of them. But, if anyone does read them all, get through them, and want some further suggestions, of course, get in touch. And there's a good bibliography in the textbook. It's quite an extensive bibliography, which you can start to look through as well. And the suggestions for extra reading at the end of the chapters and whatnot. Okay, thanks all. So I'll see you in next week's seminar.